Below is a lengthy, continuous narrative written in the style of a historical fantasy novel, imagining an alternate timeline in which Aegon Targaryen fell at the first Dornish ambush, thus preventing the Targaryen hegemony from ever taking root in Westeros. It is an original fanfiction-style piece inspired by George R. Martin's world, but it does not quote directly from any copyrighted text. The story is designed to stand on its own. It begins, they called it the Year of Broken Wings. Word spread across the 7 kingdoms that the once invincible Targaryen dragons had been vanquished as a mortal man might be. Their dream of a united realm shattered amid the blistering sands of Dorne. Though many lords had whispered that dragons were as unstoppable as the unstoppable tide, something changed the moment men realized they could die just like anyone else. On a blisteringly hot day near the foothills of the Red Mountains, the Conqueror fell, and the shape of Westeros was forever transformed. Aegon Targaryen, his sword Blackfire glimmering in the sun, had led his advance forces with supreme confidence. He came not as a conqueror that day but as a wary invader, carefully navigating territory that had resisted every attempt at subjugation. They said Aegon wanted to flush out the Dornish defenders, to force them into a pitched battle where his dragon, Balerion the Black Dread, would turn men into embers and cities into ash if need be. Yet at the Red Mountain's dusty foot, a subtle cunning awaited him, and the lords of Dorne, who had spent generations fighting off invaders from the Stormlands and the Reach, at last found a chance to do the impossible. It was not that the Conqueror was careless. Indeed, he had circled overhead on Balerion several times that morning, scanning the terrain for any sign of a trap. But the Dornish had learned to hide. They'd learned to keep their secrets in caves and ravines and within stony hollows. Where Aegon expected a direct confrontation, he found only shifting sands. Behind him trailed the Targaryen foot soldiers, men hardened by recent conquests in the Reach and the Stormlands, carrying the proud banners of the 3-headed dragon. Spears and swords gleamed in the desert glare. When at last they saw movement on the horizon, shadowy shapes dancing over the dunes, they drew their lines, prepared for an open fight. The horsemen appeared first, clad in leathers and flowing desert silks. Quick as serpents, they used curved swords and slender lances, and they did not ride to meet the Targaryen forces head-on. Rather they circled, teased, and then disappeared behind dust clouds raised by their galloping mounts. From above, Aegon might have laughed, certain that no band of skirmishers could stop Balerion's might. But as the dragon swooped low, black wings beating a vortex of sand and heat, a sudden barrage of scorpion bolts flew from hidden positions among the rocks. Balerion roared, twisting in midair as an iron-tipped bolt gashed his flank, and a second buried itself in his wing membrane. The mighty beast shuddered, belching flame in wild arcs. Aegon clung to the spines with all his strength, guiding Balerion upward, away from the sting below. Through the swirling haze of sand, archers emerged, Dornish archers, famed for their stealth in rocky terrain. Another volley soared. The men on the ground shouted for their king, some stumbling over dunes, trying to keep the formation. But Aegon was pinned to the sky, desperately maneuvering his injured dragon to safety. The ambush had begun in earnest, and out of that swirling confusion came a final shot. A scorpion bolt that found Balerion's underbelly at precisely the wrong angle. The monstrous black dragon let out a keening cry that turned blood to ice. For a heartbeat, a hush passed over the battlefield. Then Balerion lurched, wings folding like broken sails, and Aegon Targaryen was pitched from the saddle. The king fell. He might have survived had he landed in sand. Instead, his body slammed into a cluster of rocks, and when the dust finally settled, the Conqueror lay broken against the stones, his once mighty sword lost to the desert. Balerion, agonized, crashed half a mile away, shrieking flames and thrashing, scything away lines of Dornish skirmishers who had come too close. The Targaryen foot soldiers rushed in panic. Some tried to reach their king's body, others fled, and all around them, Dornish horsemen slashed and stabbed with ruthless precision. Blood seeped into the red-brown dust, and the loyalist banners flapped forlornly beneath a brutal sun. In that single hour, the illusions of Targaryen invincibility were shattered. Visenya and Rhaenys, waiting deeper within the camp, each perched upon their own dragons, watched in horror from a distance. By the time word reached them that Aegon had fallen, the field was lost. Visenya soared in on Vhagar to retrieve what she could of her brother's remains, though she could only reach a ruined patch of ground strewn with bodies. Arrows pattered off Vhagar's scales, making the dragon shriek and spew fire back at the concealed ambushers. Not far away, mare axes circled behind dunes, Rhaenys urging her mount to obliterate any visible archers. Yet the Dornish hid well. Their cunning was to attack swiftly, then vanish into the labyrinth of the Red Mountains. That day ended with a half-burnt desert, scattered corpses of Targaryen infantry, and the unstoppable weight of a new reality. Aegon Targaryen was dead. The dream of a united Westeros under dragon banners died with him, or so it was said. Though Visenya and Rhaenys survived, the mortal blow to their cause had been struck. Even they, with dragons, could not hold the conquest alone. The blow had come too soon, before the Seven Kingdoms had bent the knee, before Targaryen authority was established in every corner of the land. The great houses that had only recently sworn fealty, some grudgingly, found themselves rethinking their oaths. Within a fortnight, rumors spread. Aegon's remains had been retrieved by Visenya. The battered, mourning queen took the body back across the Dornish marches to the safety of Blackwater Bay, near where the beginnings of the new capital city had been staked out. Some said she arranged to burn his remains in the greatest funeral pyre the world had ever seen. Others swore she tried to feed Aegon's remains to Balerion, believing some Targaryen ritual might resurrect him. Yet Balerion was too badly wounded to fly for long, nor did the dread black beast respond to Visenya's commands as it once had. Wounded in scale and spirit, Balerion's spirit was broken. The unstoppable monster had been reminded of his mortality. Back along the marches, the Dornish were exultant. Their prince, and above all Princess Maria Martell, delighted in sending ravens to every corner of Westeros, proclaiming that Dorne remained free, unbroken, and that Targaryen fire did not burn bright enough to conquer the desert land. Another message, more subtly, went out as well. The Targaryens are not gods. They bleed. They die. And so the fractures in the realm began. Over a century might pass before any real talk of unity under the dragon banner rose again. But in that moment, the shards of conquest lay scattered like shattered glass, and each great lord scrambled to gather the pieces. Highgarden, seat of House Tyrell, had only lately submitted to Aegon's rule after the Field of Fire. Mern Gardner was gone, his line extinguished, and the Tyrell stewards had ascended, swearing fealty to Aegon Targaryen in exchange for recognizing them as lords paramount of the Reach. But with Aegon dead, the powerful lords of the Reach started to question the arrangement. Some whispered that a Gardner scion might still exist, a bastard or distant cousin who could press a rightful claim. Others considered forging new alliances, perhaps with Casterly Rock or the Stormlands. Meanwhile, across the wide expanses of fields and orchards, small folk who had dreaded Dragonfire felt a surge of hope that they needn't fear the Targaryens any longer. At Casterly Rock, Loren Lannister was said to be furious. He had bent the knee to Aegon only after seeing firsthand the horror of Dragonfire. Now, with Aegon gone, the Lannister king who had become a vassal saw a chance to reassert his independence. A single raven arrived from King's Landing, though the capital city was still barely more than the beginnings of a fortress on the Blackwater, urging him to remain loyal to the Targaryen sisters. But Loren had tested Targaryen might once and suffered for it. In the wake of Aegon's death, the Targaryen host was in disarray. Did he owe fealty to two queens with no strong network of alliances, struggling to hold even the crownlands? Still, the greatest shift came in the north. Torrhen Stark, who had marched south once already and knelt before the unstoppable threat of 3 dragons, learned through ravens that Aegon was dead. Torrhen's vow had been to a king who no longer breathed. The North had no love for southern entanglements. The moment they recognized the Targaryen grip was loosening, the lords of Winterfell began to weigh the value of binding themselves to distant queens who might never again send dragons north. Some suspected that Rhaenys and Visenya would try to hold power, but their armies were scattered, and the north was far indeed from any direct threat. Gradually, people began to whisper, the king in the north once more, but no one moved too hastily. For all their grief and sudden vulnerability, the Targaryen sisters still possessed dragons, albeit wounded ones, and that alone could still be a fearsome deterrent. Balerion licked his wounds near the new Targaryen seat, called King's Landing by those who had once followed Aegon. Vhagar and Meraxes remained fit for flight, though their might paled without the Conqueror's leadership. Rhaenys and Visenya, undone by grief, began forging a plan that might preserve the legacy of House Targaryen in Westeros, if not the absolute conquest Aegon had envisioned. In the weeks after Aegon's funeral, a gloom settled on King's Landing. The place was only a rough patchwork of wooden buildings, palisades, tents, and half-built stone ramparts. With their host diminished and their king slain, many men deserted, returning to their homelands to see which way the wind would blow. Only the most loyal knights, the greatest believers in Targaryen supremacy, or those who feared what might happen if they abandoned the dragons altogether, remained behind. Queen Visenya grew stern and silent, rarely emerging from her chambers in the half-finished Red Keep. She spent her time tending to Balerion's injuries, plotting with a handful of trusted knights, and hurling curses upon Dorne. Rhaenys, meanwhile, was the more diplomatic of the two, sending ravens across the land, inviting lords to reaffirm their fealty to the memory of Aegon and the Targaryen cause. She tried to keep the lines of peace open, offering gracious gestures, pardons, titles, positions of influence. She believed that the Targaryen conquest need not die, that it could be salvaged through alliances rather than pure terror. Yet the lords of Westeros were uncertain. The Targaryen foothold in the Crownlands was not stable. The dragons had been proven mortal. If ever there was a time to push back, it was now. So her letters went unanswered, or at best earned a polite but non-committal response. A few lesser houses remained loyal, hoping to gain from the sisters' uncertain rule, but the true power, places like Casterly Rock, Highgarden, the Eyrie, and Storm's End, drifted away or plotted in silence. Amid this swirling chaos, the Dornish pressed their advantage. Raiders began crossing into the marches, sacking Targaryen outposts and allied villages. The idea that Aegon's sisters might unleash draconic revenge upon them seemed not to faze them. They had killed the Conqueror once, so why not kill more Targaryens if need be? In the deserts of Dorne, the prince, or rather Princess Meria, known as the Yellow Toad of Dorne, relished the infamy of having slain the most fearsome king in generations. She demanded crippling concessions from any Targaryen envoys that dared cross her lands. Rhaenys tried to negotiate, though Visenya wanted only to burn Sunspear to ash. Tension crackled between the sisters. When the final straw came, it arrived on the scaled back of Meraxes. Rhaenys, in a desperate attempt to showcase Targaryen might, flew south with a small retinue of knights. She believed if she could speak with Princess Meria face to face, she might find a tenuous peace. But Meria had no interest in peace. Her men launched another cunning trap in the desert. Unlike Aegon's demise, Rhaenys avoided death by the narrowest margin. Meraxes sustained a grave injury to one wing. Seeing the spears, scorpion bolts, and the readiness of the Dornish to kill without hesitation, Rhaenys realized diplomacy was impossible. She barely escaped back to the Crownlands, battered and humiliated, her beloved dragon injured, just like Balerion. Another blow to Targaryen power. In the weeks that followed, both sisters recognized a hard truth. They were outmatched if they dared fight all of Westeros alone. Dorne had proven it was too dangerous to subdue. The realm's other great houses were drifting away or forging new alliances, smelling Targaryen weakness. The cost of continuing Aegon's conquest was impossibly high, so they huddled together by candlelight in the half-built Red Keep Solar. Maps lay strewn across the table, anchors for a grand plan that had once existed, how to unite all the kingdoms under one banner. Their voices echoed in the chamber. Should they retreat entirely, returning across the sea to Dragonstone, the seat of their ancestors? Or should they cling to the Crownlands, forging from that small corner of Westeros a secure Targaryen domain? Visenya argued for a more martial approach. Gather loyal men, hire mercenaries if necessary, bleed the Crownlands for gold, and crush the Stormlands as a warning. She vowed to rain dragonfire on the Dornish again and again, no matter the cost. Rhaenys, still reeling from her injuries, disagreed. She knew that a war on multiple fronts would end in ruin. Already the finances of House Targaryen were drained by the conquest, and morale was low. She suggested they fortify a strong seat near Blackwater Bay, hold the Crownlands if possible, and at least remain a power in the region, something between an independent kingdom and a formidable lordship. It would not be the sweeping dream Aegon had imagined, but it might preserve House Targaryen from total annihilation. But while the sisters quarreled, the rest of Westeros moved on. At Storm's End, House Baratheon teetered between loyalty and independence. Orys Baratheon, Aegon's rumored bastard brother, had marched with the Targaryens from the very beginning. In the original timeline of conquest, he had helped subdue the Stormlands, deposing Argilac the Arrogant. Yet now, with Aegon gone, Orys found himself Lord of Storm's End in name, but short of Targaryen support. Some Stormlords still despised him for what they saw as a betrayal of Argilac. And so Orys was caught. Should he cling to the Targaryen cause out of familial loyalty to Aegon's memory? Or should he proclaim himself fully independent, forging a new Baratheon dynasty recognized by the other great lords? In the Vale, the young King Ronal Arryn, who had once been taken for a flight atop a dragon by Rhaenys, thrilling the boy enough to earn fealty, grew older and more cautious under the guidance of his mother, the Dowager Queen Shara. The Arryns had submitted to the Targaryens because no army could stand against dragonfire. Yet with the Targaryen host diminished, the Vale's towering mountains and formidable Eyrie, safe from large-scale invasions, gave them confidence to reconsider. Word reached them of renewed independence in the north and potential alliances to the south. The seeds of a reemergence of the old Seven Kingdoms were spreading. Then came a major turning point. Lord Loren Lannister, in a show of boldness that might have gotten him burned alive under different circumstances, crowned himself King of the Rock once more. He did it in a grand ceremony in Lannisport, with lords and ladies from the Westerlands in attendance. The Lannister banners billowed, and red and gold streamers filled the harbor, proclaiming a new era of Lannister kingship. No dragons came swooping in to punish him. No Targaryen legion marched west to quell the rebellion. Visenya, had she known sooner, might have tried to exact vengeance. But the raven announcing the coronation arrived too late. Some said the messenger was paid off or murdered. Others suspected a conspiracy. By the time the Targaryen sisters learned of the bold claim, Loren was already enthroned, beloved by his subjects for casting off foreign rule. That single act of defiance echoed across the realm. If the Lannisters dared retake their kingship, why should the Tyrells not do the same in the Reach? Why should the Baratheons or Arryns remain mere lords, subservient to a pair of Targaryen queens with no stable seat? Torrhen Stark, too, weighed the prospect of recrowning himself king in the north, though the Stark's old oath to Aegon once weighed heavy on him. He had bent the knee to avoid the slaughter of his people. Now that threat had abated. At last, tension within the Red Keep snapped. Visenya, furious at each new piece of news, first the renewed Dornish raids, then the Lannisters' coronation, took Vhagar south, ignoring Rhaenys' pleas. Visenya intended to lay waste to the Stormlands, to bring the unruly kingdoms to heel through fear. But it was no simple thing. She might have tried to strike at the Westerlands directly, scorching Lannisport as a demonstration, but the distance was great and the Targaryen ground forces were too weak to hold any territory. So she chose the closer target, Storm's End, seat of Orys Baratheon. With Vhagar's might, Visenya believed she could force the Stormlords to reaffirm loyalty, and from there perhaps crush the Dornish. She would do this alone if she had to. The flight south took only a few days. Dawn broke over the narrow sea, painting the horizon in bruised purple and gold as Vhagar descended upon Storm's End. The fortress was perched on a cliff battered by storms, a ring of ancient walls said to be unbreachable. Yet no fortress could withstand dragonfire, so Visenya believed. She made a show of circling overhead, letting the defenders gawk at Vhagar's size. Then she lowered herself onto the courtyard, demanding entrance, proclaiming herself regent of the Iron Throne, there to speak with Lord Orys Baratheon. Her presence sent the castle into uproar. Orys, though loyal to Aegon's memory, did not rush forth with open arms. He had to think of the Storm Lords, who grumbled that they'd never asked to be conquered. He had to consider the threat from Dorne on the southern border, where Argella Durrandon's supporters still skirmished. In the end, Orys met Visenya at the castle gates. Their conversation was laced with tension. Visenya demanded fealty, demanded that Orys muster his forces to help crush the Dornish. Orys demurred. He insisted the Stormlands were beset by enough troubles of their own. He offered to remain allied to House Targaryen if he were recognized as king of the Stormlands, an arrangement that would have the Targaryens essentially ceding real power. Visenya's eyes burned at the insult. She refused, threatening to reduce Storm's End to rubble if Orys dared name himself king. The next morning, a storm broke over the coast. Waves crashed against the towering walls, and the sky churned. Visenya, defiant, mounted Vhagar, intending to show her strength with a single terrifying display of dragonfire. But as Vhagar rose, thunder rattled the sky. The ancient fortress walls had weathered centuries of storms and unstoppable gales. A single pass of fire, no matter how hot, might not bring them down immediately. Rain pelted Vhagar's wings as she circled. The spectators in the courtyard below gaped in awe and horror. Then, from a hidden ballista platform on a turret, a scorpion bolt shot out, narrowly missing Vhagar's belly. Another soared, nicking the dragon's leg. Visenya roared for vengeance, guiding her mount lower, unleashing a plume of flame that devoured one of the ballista crews in a conflagration. Charred timbers collapsed, men screaming in the thick of the storm. Orys, furious, rushed with his guard, but there was little he could do to stop a dragon from the ramparts. Visenya soared around for another pass. She had threatened to burn Storm's End if Orys did not bend the knee, and she prepared to make good on her promise. But the storm's fury rose. Sheets of rain battered Vhagar. Swirling winds made flight erratic. In that confusion, Orys' men reloaded another scorpion. They had long studied the Dornish tactics, for word of the successful ambush that killed Aegon had spread. Their bolt flew high off target, but the next found purchase in Vhagar's flank. The dragon let out a furious roar that rattled the entire fortress. She belched flame wildly, setting a portion of the walls ablaze despite the downpour. Timbers cracked, stone scorched, yet Storm's End did not crumble. At last, Visenya recognized the futility of trying to breach the fortress alone in such conditions. She withdrew, hurling curses down at Orys, vowing that if he would not reaffirm Targaryen supremacy, she would treat him as an enemy. She and Vhagar vanished into the storm, leaving the castle smoldering but not destroyed, and Orys Baratheon left to brood over the confrontation. He had not lost Storm's End. The Targaryen queen had not prevailed. The realm had another story of how the Targaryens could be resisted. When word reached the Red Keep of Visenya's disastrous sortie, Rhaenys was incensed. She confronted her sister, demanding to know why she would risk their dwindling power in a rash assault. The two argued in the echoing corridors, each certain that her path was the only way to preserve House Targaryen. Rhaenys believed they must retreat, focus on building alliances, and use the dragons sparingly, more as symbols than instruments of raw terror. Visenya, consumed by anger over Aegon's death, saw no way forward except utter destruction of their enemies. Their shouting match reverberated through the half-finished hall. Guards turned aside, anxious not to attract the queen's ire. In the end, the sisters reached an uneasy stalemate. Both realized neither had the resources to go it alone. They needed each other, battered as the relationship had become. Meanwhile, Westeros continued to drift apart. In the Reach, Harlan Tyrell, styled King Harlan by those who followed him, quietly took the old sigil of House Gardner, grafting it alongside the Tyrell Rose. He extended alliances to the houses that had once served the Gardners, seeking legitimacy. The Tyrells still controlled the bountiful farmland and could muster one of the largest armies. With the Stormlands in turmoil and Dorne emboldened, the Reach faced threats on two borders, so King Harlan brokered a loose alliance with the Martells. Though ancient rivals, the Dornish and the people of the Reach now shared a common cause in thwarting Targaryen aggression. In the Riverlands, House Tully had been an early supporter of the Targaryens, reaping the reward of becoming lords paramount of the Trident. Yet with Aegon gone and the realm fracturing, other river lords questioned the Tully ascendancy. Riverrun braced itself, uncertain whether to remain loyal to the Targaryen queens or to attempt some manner of independence. The Blackwoods, the Brackens, the Freys, they all had their long-standing rivalries and ambitions. Some even considered aligning with the Vale or the North, especially if the Targaryens could no longer protect them from the Ironborn or the Lannisters. The Great Conquest had left them in flux, bound to a distant power that might no longer exist next year. So the Riverlands hovered in a delicate balance, waiting to see which side proved stronger. All of this upheaval, all the chaos of a realm once teetering on the edge of unity, eventually drew the attention of far-flung corners, particularly the Iron Islands. Aegon had beaten their reavers into submission when he set Black Harren's monstrous castle of Harrenhal aflame, killing Harren the Black and installing the Tullus in the Riverlands. The memory of Harren's fiery death still lingered among the Ironborn, reminding them of the cost of challenging dragons. But now that cost seemed cheaper. With Aegon fallen and the Targaryens on the defensive, the Ironborn contemplated new raids along the western coasts, maybe even a reassertion of the old kingdom of the Isles. Many a Salt King rose up in the Iron Islands, proclaiming a new era of reaving. Their longships began to fan out, plundering coastal villages in the Westerlands and the Reach, hoping to exploit the confusion. Yet amidst this creeping disintegration, there was one glimmer of Targaryen potency: Rhaenys' skill in forging personal relationships and sowing pockets of loyalty. She traveled by ship to the Vale, leaving Meraxes to heal in King's Landing. She arrived in Gulltown under a banner of truce, determined to speak personally with Queen Shara Arryn and young King Ronal. Her approach was gentle. She promised friendship, trade agreements, and mutual respect. No immediate demand of fealty, no threat of dragonfire. She relied on the memory of that day she had once taken Ronal for a ride upon Meraxes, how it had filled the boy with awe and excitement. For weeks she stayed as a guest in the Eyrie, entertaining the court with music, poetry, and retellings of the struggles House Targaryen had faced. In the end, Rhaenys wrested from the Arryns a vow of neutrality rather than outright loyalty, which she considered a victory of sorts. The Vale would not declare Ronal as king of the Vale. They would neither bend the knee nor declare war on the Targaryens. It was a precarious arrangement, but it at least kept one more front from erupting into conflict. Rhaenys returned to King's Landing with that small triumph, hopeful that if she could replicate such diplomacy with the Riverlords and perhaps even Storm's End, House Targaryen might endure. But Visenya had other plans. She had never abandoned her rage, nor her thirst for vengeance against Dorne. One cold dawn, she again mounted Vhagar and flew far south, ignoring her sister's pleas. Rather than assaulting Sunspear outright, she terrorized a string of Dornish villages along the marches, unleashing dragonfire upon farmland, watchtowers, and any outpost that bore the Martell sigil. Hundreds died, flames devouring homes and crops. Yet just as with Aegon's campaign, the Dornish refused to meet her in open battle. They melted into stony hideouts, scattering across the deserts. Visenya's wrath found few direct targets, and her dragon eventually returned home, leaving behind columns of smoke but no real victory. Indeed, the devastation only further steeled Dornish hatred, ensuring that if the Targaryens ever ventured south of the Red Mountains again, they would be met with an ambush like the one that claimed Aegon. In King's Landing, the rift between the sisters grew deeper. Rhaenys, despairing, tried to moderate Visenya's fury, but each new report from the Stormlands or the Reach or the Westerlands fueled Visenya's conviction that only fear and fire could save them. Yet the more she tried to rule by fear, the more the realm slipped away. Bit by bit, the newly styled kings of the Rock, the Reach, the Iron Islands, and eventually the North, when Torrhen Stark finally accepted the crown again, reasserted their independence. The Targaryens were left with a tenuous hold over the Crownlands, a nominal alliance with the Vale, and a contested claim to the Stormlands. Before half a year had passed, Orys Baratheon announced his intention to wed a daughter of House Caron, forging an alliance that would strengthen his position. Rumors swirled that he might declare himself king of the Stormlands as well, though he hesitated, unsure whether that would push the Targaryen queens to open war. Instead, Orys carefully navigated the politics, seeking to keep the Stormlords united under his leadership without triggering a catastrophic dragon assault on Storm's End again. Meanwhile, smaller houses in the Crownlands, like the Rosbys, the Stokeworths, the Macys, became uncertain whether to continue paying taxes to Targaryen forces or to quietly align with the realm's new kings. It was said that Rhaenys felt Aegon's presence nightly in the half-finished Red Keep, where the wind howled through empty corridors. She would pace among the newly laid stones, whispering how it was supposed to be. A grand capital bridging the continents, a shining seat of dragonkind. She had glimpsed that dream: power, unity, the forging of a new realm at peace with itself, and now it was turning to ash. Late at night, she would take Meraxes high above Blackwater Bay, gazing at the scattered lights of the city below, wondering if it would have been better if they had never left Dragonstone. Yet she did not flee. She held on for the sake of House Targaryen, for the memory of the man she had loved. As the months stretched into a year, the shape of Westeros stabilized into a patchwork of fractious kingdoms. Loren Lannister kept the Westerlands as the Kingdom of the Rock. Harlan Tyrell ruled as King of the Reach, forging a wary pact with Dorne, which remained fiercely independent under Princess Meria's line. Torrhen Stark in the North seldom meddled in southern affairs, content to guard his borders. The Vale, under Ronal Arryn, neither recrowned itself nor bowed fully to Targaryen dictates, effectively functioning as an isolated domain behind its mountains. The Iron Islands reawakened under various self-styled Salt Kings, reaving where they wished, and the Riverlands, though nominally Tully-ruled, found themselves beset by local power struggles, unsure whether to maintain an uneasy loyalty to the Targaryen queens or to throw in with the Lannisters or the Vale, depending on who offered better terms. Within this fragmented mosaic, the Targaryens clung to a narrow belt of the Crownlands, bolstered by the presence of 3 dragons. Yet that presence was not what it had been. Balerion still bore scars from the Dornish scorpion bolts. Though terrifying to behold, his flights were shorter, his ferocity seemingly diminished. Meraxes likewise had a crippled wing, and while still formidable, her flights were cautious. Only Vhagar still possessed near full vitality, but even the older dragon was not unstoppable alone, as events at Storm's End had shown. Meanwhile, the Crownlands themselves chafed under ever-increasing taxes. Visenya insisted they squeeze gold to fund a new host of mercenaries, believing she could raise an army big enough to quell at least one rebellious kingdom, demonstrating Targaryen might. But few Sellswords were eager to fight a losing war, and so the Targaryens found themselves short on allies and coin. One night, Rhaenys called a secret council in the Red Keep. She summoned those knights and lords still loyal to House Targaryen, the Celtigars of Claw Isle, the Valerians of Driftmark, a handful of Crownlands lords. Over candlelight and cups of spiced wine, she laid out the choice that now faced them: remain locked in a futile struggle to reclaim the entire continent, or negotiate some form of lasting peace. Those present offered different views. Some believed the Targaryens could still achieve a partial conquest if they struck at the right target, perhaps the Riverlands or the Iron Islands. Others argued for a grand alliance with the Vale or even the Westerlands, aimed at containing the Ironborn threat. Rhaenys listened quietly, but in her heart she sensed that the age of open conquest had ended with Aegon's death. She just needed her sister Visenya to see reason. In the gloom of a nearly deserted throne room, little more than a cavernous stone hall with an unfinished dais, Rhaenys confronted Visenya once more. She asked her sister if she truly intended to burn half of Westeros in pursuit of a dream that had died on Dornish stones. In response, Visenya turned her glare upon her sister, eyes flickering with a fanatic's intensity. She recalled how they had once soared across the sky, unstoppable, forging a legacy that might have endured for centuries. She blamed herself for not preventing Aegon's death, and she blamed the realm for turning on them so quickly, forgetting the vow they had made to the rightful conquerors. She insisted that if they did not crush the rebellious kings, House Targaryen would be devoured in time, piece by piece. Rhaenys tried gentleness, speaking of the possibility that the Targaryens could maintain a single, formidable kingdom around Blackwater Bay, forging alliances, coexisting with other monarchs, kings in the Rock, the Reach, the Stormlands, and so on. It might be an uneasy peace, but it was better than endless war. Visenya spat at the notion. She would not let the Targaryen name fade into the chaos of petty kings. She wanted the realm Aegon had dreamed of, the realm he had nearly seized. And so sister parted from sister in grief and anger, each unable to sway the other. 2 weeks later, the situation reached another breaking point. Visenya, through clandestine messengers, struck a deal with a notorious free company from Essos known for savage tactics. She promised them gold and lands in the Crownlands if they helped subjugate the Stormlands or the Reach. When Rhaenys learned of this, she was horrified. Allowing foreign sellswords to ravage Westeros would only deepen the realm's hatred of House Targaryen. But Visenya would not be dissuaded. She intended to lead these mercenaries south, crush Orys Baratheon's forces, and claim Storm's End as a second seat of power. That would be the foundation of a new wave of Targaryen conquest, or so she proclaimed. Desperate, Rhaenys confronted Visenya in front of the entire court, condemning the plan as madness. Visenya retorted that if Rhaenys had the stomach to help her, they wouldn't need foreign swords. The argument escalated until Visenya issued a challenge. Let them settle this dispute in single combat, Targaryen versus Targaryen, sister versus sister, for the right to rule in Aegon's name. Rhaenys recoiled. She loved her sister, despite their many disagreements. But Visenya's eyes were lit with a dark fervor, and she could not be talked down. The court, aghast, watched as 2 Targaryen queens drew steel. Rhaenys, better known as a diplomat than a warrior, took up a slender blade. Visenya unsheathed Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel sword that she had wielded in battle for many years. A hush fell, broken only by the crackle of torches in the gloom. Rhaenys pleaded one last time for reason. Visenya, tears of rage glimmering on her cheeks, answered with a savage slash. Steel rang on steel. The duel was swift, brutal, tinged with heartbreak. Visenya's skill as a warrior was unmatched. Rhaenys tried to defend and disarm, but she was outmatched in sheer swordplay. In the final exchange, Dark Sister tore through Rhaenys' guard and slashed deep across her abdomen. She collapsed to the cold stone floor, breath coming in gasps. In the shocked stillness, Visenya stood over her sister, trembling, Dark Sister stained red. For a terrible moment, it seemed she might finish the job, but then she sank to her knees, tears streaming, cradling Rhaenys as the younger queen's life ebbed. Rhaenys' final words were said to be pleas for peace, for Visenya not to waste more lives in pursuit of a dead man's dream. Then she breathed her last. So ended the second Targaryen queen, without the clash of armies or the roar of dragons, but at the hand of her own kin. Visenya, devastated, ordered Rhaenys' body to be placed upon a funeral pyre. The watchers in the Red Keep could do nothing but bear witness, torn between horror and pity. House Targaryen's fracturing now became complete, and the realm's fate seemed darker than ever. Some lords left King's Landing that very night, convinced Visenya had gone mad. Others, fearful of the queen's wrath, stayed, hoping to survive the chaos or even profit from the new order. Visenya, cloaked in mourning black, withdrew into a furious solitude. She raged that Rhaenys had forced her hand. She told no one of her nightmares, how she dreamed of Aegon's broken body lying in the Dornish sand, and Rhaenys' final plea echoing in her ears. She only spoke of war and vengeance and forging the realm anew. In the months that followed, that vengeance manifested in brutal campaigns in the Crownlands and Stormlands. Visenya marched with her new sellsword allies, forcibly seizing minor keeps, burning villages suspected of disloyalty, and demanding fealty in the name of the Iron Throne. She mounted Vagor when necessary, incinerating any castle that resisted. Yet even then, she faced stiff opposition. Orys Baratheon rallied his bannermen, forging alliances with local lords who feared Targaryen retribution. Skirmishes erupted along the Windwater, with blood staining the once quiet riverbanks. Storm's End remained unassailable behind its mighty walls, especially after Orys invested heavily in scorpions and other anti-dragon artillery, gleaned from Dornish tactics. The Targaryen armies, if one could still call them that, found themselves paying in gold and blood for every step forward. The sellswords demanded higher wages, threatened desertion, or resorted to looting to compensate themselves. Farmers fled, draining the crownlands of produce, leading to shortages in King's Landing. More lords abandoned Visenya, seeing no future in her regime, and all the while the realm's new kings plotted and watched. The Lannisters solidified their domain, building alliances with the River Lords. The Tyrells fed their large armies from the bountiful fields, forging a robust power base. The North stood aloof, unchallenged. Dorne remained defiant and unconquered, quietly content that the Targaryens were too embroiled in conflict elsewhere to threaten them again. Eventually, the situation became dire enough that even Visenya recognized the impossibility of reassembling Aegon's grand conquest. Too many foes, not enough coin, and the heartbreak that haunted her every action. She began to withdraw to the Red Keep more often, leaving the mercenaries to ravage the Stormlands in disorganized bands. Rumors circulated that the Queen spent long hours in the deepest chambers of the castle, poring over ancient Valyrian texts, searching for some lost sorcery that might restore Balerion to full strength or raise Aegon from the grave. Others whispered she took to riding Vagor in the dead of night, seeking out tombs or haunted places, always returning with a cold silence, a hollowness in her eyes. As the years slipped by, King's Landing never truly blossomed into the magnificent capital it might have been. The half-finished Red Keep stood as a fortress and a monument to the Targaryens' unfulfilled ambitions. Meanwhile, the Seven Kingdoms reverted to the status they had known before the dragons ever came, a patchwork of separate realms, each with its own king. True, the memory of Aegon's brief and terrible conquest lingered. That memory alone was enough to cow some smaller lords, to keep them from challenging the Targaryens directly. He wished to be scorched from the sky, but as time passed, the dragons themselves aged, diminished, occasionally clashed with scorpion bolts in fruitless raids, or left to brood in Dragonstone. There were no new dragons, no new Targaryens rising to reassert the conquest. One day, more than a decade after Aegon's death, there was talk of Visenya's final journey to Dragonstone. She took Vagor across the sea, leaving a skeleton crew in the Red Keep. Perhaps she planned to summon some ancient Valyrian magic from the catacombs beneath the old fortress. Or perhaps she simply wished to die among the relics of her homeland, far from the realm that had broken her spirit. But from that day forward, she was rarely seen again in the Crownlands. The rumor was she had locked herself in the deepest labyrinth of Dragonstone, with only the faint, fading roars of Vagor echoing across the black shores on moonless nights. And so the Targaryens, once poised to unite the continent, dwindled into legend, left to nurse their wounds and regrets in the bleak isolation of the ancient seat. In the vacuum they left behind, Westeros continued as a land of 7 fractured kingdoms, each wary of the other, occasionally forging alliances or waging small wars. The Lannisters and the Tyrells emerged as the most prominent powers south of the Neck, with the Martells ever cunning in their desert strongholds, the Baratheons forging a proud if tenuous monarchy in the Stormlands, the Arryns proud in their mountain eyrie, and the Starks re-establishing the old line of kings in the north. The Tullys in the Riverlands found themselves caught in the middle, sometimes swearing loyalty to the King of the Rock, other times forging deals with the Vale or the Reach to secure their borders. And the Iron Islands remained a perpetual thorn in the side of coastal lords, reaving and raiding, occasionally uniting under a charismatic Salt King, but mostly scattering into warring captains. As for the small folk, life went on. Some remembered the dragons with terror. Others told tales of that single glorious year when the Targaryens had almost bound all of Westeros together under one crown. Minstrels sang of Aegon's defeat in Dorne, how the sun and spears had brought low the greatest fire-breathing monster in history. They sang of how the unstoppable Conqueror's bones were broken on the Red Mountains, and how from that day onward, men knew dragons were not gods. Yet among some, a strange yearning remained. Huddled in taverns or around hearth fires on cold winter nights, people wondered if it might have been better had Aegon lived, if the realm might have been spared countless petty wars, if the great conquest would have ushered in an age of peace. Such fantasies were whispered only among the quiet corners, for the new kings saw no advantage in praising the Targaryens. Still, dreams are not easily killed. Even in far-off Old Town, certain maesters debated how Westeros might have prospered if the realm had been united under a single royal house, sealed in dragon flame and Valyrian steel. They wrote treatises about the possible future that was lost that day Aegon fell at the first Dornish ambush. But the truth was as harsh as the Dornish sands. The Targaryen hegemony ended almost as soon as it began, and though echoes of Valyria lingered in their blood, though dragons still lived in some shadowed corners of the Crownlands, that fleeting empire died with the Conqueror. And so Westeros, battered and fractious, remained a land of many kings, forging and breaking alliances, raising armies and fighting border skirmishes, as it had for thousands of years. The red sun of Dorne rose high in the south, the direwolf prowled the northern snows, the lion roared in the west, and the rose, falcon, stag, and kraken each staked their claims on their ancestral domains. Only a faint echo of wing beats reminded men of a time when a single house dared dream of forging one realm for many, and failed, undone by an arrow and a fall, on a day the desert wind howled victory for the free lords of Dorne. So ended the grand Targaryen gambit, a cautionary tale told for generations. And in the halls of Dragonstone, where gloom enveloped a lonely queen and her aging dragon, the last sparks of that dream smoldered in darkness, waiting for the winds of time to extinguish them completely, or perhaps to stir them once more to life in an age yet to come. Dark rumors clung to Dragonstone like barnacles on a beached ship. Over the course of a decade, nearly all outside the island fortress heard only whispers of Queen Visenya's name. Some said she stalked its basalt halls alone, clad in black and silver, her eyes burning with the memory of a sister she had slain. Others claimed she kept silent court with nothing but the battered skulls of her dragon's ancestors for company. In the small fishing villages on the rocky shores below, a handful of local fisherfolk occasionally glimpsed the silhouette of Vhagar on moonlit nights, massive wings eclipsing the stars, drifting out over the sea. Once in a great while, there came an echoing roar. Then the darkness returned. At first, a token Targaryen garrison remained at the half-built Red Keep across Blackwater Bay, but their numbers trickled away with each season. The mercenaries Visenya had hired to punish the Stormlands, starved of coin and purpose once their queen vanished, either melted into outlaw bands or sailed back to Essos. The local lords of the Crownlands, Rosby, Stokeworth, Hayford, Massey, slowly ceased paying taxes to a deserted throne. Many recalled the ambition that had once kindled Aegon's conquest, but it had burned out, leaving only embers buried in the rubble. King's Landing never became a true city. It remained more of a muddy sprawl, a scattering of empty wooden structures and old siege towers. A palisade leaned drunkenly around a small harbor, where driftwood and rotting hulls told of better days. Few travelers bothered with the place. Those who did would see, at a distance, the jagged outline of the Red Keep's incomplete walls, caked in vines and wind-blown sand. Soldiers had once labored day and night to construct a fortress grand enough to serve as the seat of a unified kingdom. That dream died with Aegon and Rhaenys. Now crows perched on the scaffolding beams. Unkempt courtyards served as gathering grounds for goats and feral dogs. A few Crownlands knights stubbornly kept watch over the main gate, as if expecting Queen Visenya to return at any moment, but their steel grew rusty. Their loyalty turned to lifeless habit. All across Westeros, the tapestry of 7 fractious kingdoms came into sharper focus. The North, recrowned under Torrhen Stark, ruled itself without further interference from dragonkind. Far to the south, Princess Maria Martell grew older and frilier, her blindness near complete, but her great-grandchildren thrived. The Martells continued to thwart any talk of foreign overlordship, forging a network of treaties to protect Dorne's borders. Trade in olives, wines, and spices fed a quiet prosperity. Dornish raids into the Stormlands never ceased entirely, yet they became seasonal feints rather than outright invasions. The desert had proven its strength, and the rest of Westeros had accepted that Dorne was a land unto itself. The Westerlands, under King Loren Lannister, grew wealthy. Gold poured from the hills and mines, and a new generation of Lannister princes emerged, traveling across the narrow sea to Essos, forging mercantile ties that funneled luxuries back to Lannisport. Knights of the Rock, once wary of the Targaryens' return, no longer lost sleep at night. The memory of Dragonfire on the Field of Fire still cast a shadow, but every year that passed without Targaryen armies re-emerging chipped away at the fear. The Rock's high walls stood secure, the Golden Lion roared, and their monarchy came to resemble the old days before Aegon's short-lived conquest. The Reach, ever bountiful, remained the seat of House Tyrell. King Harlan Tyrell was neither beloved nor despised. He was pragmatic, if unremarkable. He had ascended as a steward's line. His family had been raised to power by Aegon after the extinction of House Gardner. Yet once Aegon fell, Harlan embraced the notion of reclaiming the title King of the Reach. He set about tying the lesser lords to his cause, wooing them with feasts, marriages, and promises of new farmland. Most obeyed. A few still whispered of old Gardner blood, rumored to linger in baseborn lines, but no credible challenge rose. Under Tyrell rule, Old Town thrived, Highgarden's tours echoed with trumpets, and the hearts of men turned away from fear of dragons. The Stormlands remained a complicated tapestry. Orys Baratheon had once been known as Aegon's rumored half-brother, rewarded with the hand of the last Durrandon princess and the castle of Storm's End. Though he never crowned himself outright, many Stormlords privately hailed him as a king in all but name. Yet after Visenya's savage raids a decade passed, Orys' health deteriorated. He walked with a cane, bearing scars from the skirmishes that raged along the Wendwater. His influence ebbed. Some Stormlords blamed him for inviting the Targaryen conquest in the first place, calling it a curse upon their lands. Over time, the fractious Stormlords splintered, each more eager to expand their personal holdings or secure new alliances than to unify under Orys' banner. Storm's End remained formidable, but whether it would ever become the heart of a stable kingdom was unclear. Eastward, in the Vale, young King Ronal Arryn came of age. Under the careful stewardship of his mother, Shara, he had avoided any open break with the Targaryens, even as Visenya's presence in the Crownlands dwindled. The Eyrie soared in solitude. The high passes and watchful nights kept the Vale safe from outside threat. From Gulltown, ships sailed to Bravos and Pentos, forging quiet trade. And all the while, Ronal's private council debated whether they might extend their domain into the Riverlands, or if that would only provoke King Loren Lannister or the Tully-led Riverlords. In the end, the Arryns maintained a posture of caution, focusing inward, building roads through the foothills, improving farmland. The memory of Ronal flying on the back of mare-axes as a boy still held a certain wonder for him. Sometimes, gazing over the ramparts at dawn, he recalled how it felt to ride a dragon. But that was a fleeting memory. The present was stable, and that was enough. In the Riverlands, House Tully's domain was neither secure nor wholly chaotic. When Edmund Tully's line had first joined Aegon, they earned the right to rule Riverrun as Lords Paramount. Then came Aegon's death and the fracturing of everything. In theory, the Tullys still held authority over the Trident. In practice, local powers like the Blackwoods, Brackens, and Freys contested each other daily. The memory of Harrenhal's flaming demise under Dragonfire lingered. Blackened towers, melted stone. No one claimed it for long before ghosts or bandits drove them out. Every so often a bold adventurer tried to restore the monstrous fortress, only to vanish. The Lords of the Trident grew accustomed to looking over their shoulders at the Lannisters to the west, the Arryns to the east, and the Ironborn raiders who might sail up the Trident from the west coast. They kept no illusions of Targaryen protection. That era was dust. Still the Iron Islands reaved, though never with the might of old. A sequence of Salt Kings rose and fell, each vying to outdo the last in raids on the coasts of the Reach, the Westerlands, or the Riverlands. Some extended their reaving to Essos, returning with exotic spoils. Occasional attempts by the Lannisters or Tyrells to blockade the Isles ended in draws, each side losing ships to storms or cunning Ironborn tactics. In that swirl, the islands never again recognized a single, indisputable king like the Grey Irons or the horrors of ages past. Their sundered chain of leadership left them a persistent menace, but rarely a unified threat. And so the pieces of Westeros settled into a precarious balance. Not true peace. Border disputes, local skirmishes, and occasional spats of banditry kept knights busy. But no single kingdom was strong enough or bold enough to attempt conquering the rest. Each region turned inward, developing its farmland, forging alliances through marriage, raising new keeps. The faith of the Seven continued to spread sermons that the gods had punished House Targaryen for arrogance. In Old Town, the High Septon himself wrote treatises on how dragons were abominations best left to vanish from the world. In the north, where the old gods reigned, such talk was irrelevant, but the result was the same. House Targaryen's moment had passed. Yet on Dragonstone, within its labyrinthine bowels, Visenya Targaryen lingered. There were whispers of what she might be doing in the island's hidden chambers. Some believed she still plotted war, seeking enough gold and manpower to attempt another conquest. Others spoke of dark rites, of ancient Valyrian sorcery that might rekindle the link between rider and dragon, or even bring back the dead. Fishermen claimed that sometimes, close to dawn, they saw fires dancing atop the volcanic hills, blue-white flames that did not belong to any normal hearth. Whether these sightings were real or figments of fearful imagination, none could say. But an aura of dread came to surround that ancient seat of House Targaryen. Sailors shunned its waters if they could. It was into this uneasy lull that new events began to ripple. The first spark was in the Stormlands, and it came from a quarter no one expected. Argella Baratheon, daughter of the late Argilac the Arrogant, the same Princess Orys Baratheon had once taken to wife. Over the decade of uneasy Stormlands rule, Argella had often overshadowed Orys at court with her fiery temper and fierce loyalty to her father's memory. She had given Orys heirs, strong sons and daughters, but she had never truly accepted the Targaryen link that bound them. The storms that lashed the coast seemed to mirror her spirit. As Orys aged and his injuries plagued him, Argella took a firmer hand in local governance. She rode from keep to keep, promising the Stormlords that House Baratheon would stand strong on its own, beholden to no queen hidden away in Dragonstone. When the time was right, Argella announced that their house would take once more the title that belonged to her father's line, King of the Stormlands. Orys, a proud man but weakened, no longer had the strength to oppose her. And so, on a windswept platform overlooking Shipbreaker Bay, Argella Baratheon placed a crown of antlers and iron upon her husband's head, declaring him King Orys, first of his name, rightful sovereign of the Stormlands. The crowd of gathered lords and soldiers cheered in a wave of thunder. Orys seemed dazed, but he did not remove the crown. This bold move carried risk. Visenya was still alive, and though she had not stirred in years, the Baratheons had once been her staunchest allies. Now Argella cast aside that loyalty with open defiance. Yet no dragon came to punish them. No Targaryen host sailed up the coast. Word spread, Queen Visenya would not, or perhaps could not, answer the slight. So the Stormlands took their place among the other re-emerged monarchies, leaving the Targaryens with no real seat on the mainland at all. The second spark came in the Riverlands. House Frey, ever ambitious, began constructing a series of expansions on the twin castles that guarded the crossing over the Green Fork. Their tolls had grown heavier each year, angering other riverlords who needed the crossing for trade or troop movements. Hostilities simmered between the Freys and the Tully-led alliance. Complaints poured into Riverrun that Lord Frey was styling himself Prince of the Crossing, a vanity that rankled the old families. The Tullys threatened to march on the twins, but discovered that several minor houses, discontent with Tully oversight, had thrown in their lot with the Freys, providing men and gold. A skirmish broke out along the Green Fork between Frey bannermen and Tully men-at-arms, each side testing the other. Blood was spilled on the riverside fields. Tully outriders burned a Frey granary. Frey archers loosed upon Tully foragers. The conflict threatened to escalate into a small war that might engulf the Riverlands and beyond. The Lannisters watched from the west with interest. King Loren Lannister had no desire to see a powerful Tully domain on his border, but neither did he particularly care to meddle unless a clear advantage emerged. It was in the midst of these tensions that a third spark, more significant than the first two, flared into being. An unexpected invitation arrived at the courts of various kings: Stark, Arryn, Lannister, Tyrell, Baratheon, and even Martell. It bore a black wax seal with 3 dragon heads pressed into it, though not in the style widely recognized as the Targaryen sigil of old. Beneath the seal, in elegant script, came a summons: "Hail to the lords paramount and kings of Westeros. I, Prince Maegor of House Targaryen, blood of the dragon, do hereby invite you or your representatives to attend a great council on Dragonstone, that we may discuss the future of our lands, the threats that encroach upon us, and the possibility of forging anew what was lost." This was the first mention in years that House Targaryen had any prince at all. It baffled many. Had Visenya birthed a child in secret? Was there some lost scion lurking among the Dragonstone labyrinths? Many recalled that Aegon and Rhaenys had no known sons. That left only Visenya, who had been rumored to meddle in dark arts. Could she have conjured a child, or found one from a distant Targaryen cousin in Essos? Ravens flew, speculation ran wild, and the realm paused in uneasy curiosity. The invitations were scarcely more detailed. They stated that after long reflection and due mourning, House Targaryen was prepared to re-enter the affairs of Westeros, not as conquerors but as equals among the great houses. The letter offered a promise of safe conduct to any who traveled to Dragonstone for the council. Each king or high lord had to decide: ignore this cryptic invitation and risk missing out on a possible new alignment, or brave the ominous fortress where Visenya reputedly dabbled in foul sorcery. In the north, Torrhen Stark, nearing the end of his reign, dismissed the notion with a snort. He had knelt once to the Targaryens, but that was when 3 dragons soared in the sky under a single unstoppable king. Now they were old and broken. He saw little to gain from re-entangling the north in southern schemes. Yet his heir, Brandon Stark, younger and more curious, argued that they should at least send an envoy. If this new Targaryen prince truly existed, if by some miracle the dragons were restored, the north could ill afford to be caught unprepared. Torrhen relented, consenting to send a small retinue of northern knights and a maester to gather knowledge. In the Westerlands, King Loren Lannister likewise debated. His courtiers whispered that the Targaryens had no real power left, so the safest course was to spurn the invitation. But Loren saw an advantage. If the Targaryens' efforts to re-establish themselves turned out to be feeble, he could glean that knowledge firsthand and use it to consolidate Lannister rule. If, on the other hand, the Targaryens had discovered a new threat or formed some alliance with Essos, ignoring them might be dangerous. He decided to send his second son, a shrewd and ambitious youth, along with a moderate entourage, to see what truth lay behind these rumors. Highgarden and Old Town were abuzz. Why? The news. King Harlan Tyrell rarely left his seat, preferring the comfort of his garden palace. But he, too, recognized the value in knowledge. He dispatched an emissary, a cousin along with several knights and a small retinue, all chosen for diplomacy. Dorne, in turn, took the matter with some amusement. Princess Meria was gone by now, and her heir, Prince Kyle Martell, remembered only too well that the Dornish had killed Aegon on their own soil. Why should they fear some Targaryen pretender? Still, Kyle sent a delegation, if only to boast that Dorne remained unconquered. The Vale answered in kind. King Ronald Arryn decided he would go in person, partly out of curiosity. He had never seen the Black Citadel of Dragonstone up close. He traveled by sea from Gulltown aboard a sleek galley, along with knights sworn to House Arryn. The Stormlands, newly crowned under King Orys, took more time to decide. Orys was bitter toward Visenya's memory and dreaded the thought of returning to Targaryen dominion. But Argella, restless for new opportunities, persuaded him to send a small party if he himself refused to go. It might be wise to learn what could threaten their newly declared kingship. Orys agreed, though he made plain his skepticism. So it came to pass that one by one, ships bearing sigils of the crowned houses arrived on the rocky shores of Dragonstone, anchoring in the harbor beneath the looming volcanic cliffs. Soldiers in scaled black armor, their faces impassive, guided the envoys through twisted corridors cut into the stone. Braziers gave off dim red light that flickered on walls carved with serpentine dragons, remnants of Valyria's artistry. The air smelled of salt and brimstone. Some envoys whispered that the castle felt more tomb than fortress. Yet the Targaryen guards offered no threat, merely silent escort toward a grand hall that many had never heard existed. Within that hall, high pillars shaped like dragon talons rose toward a vaulted ceiling. Iron sconces held torches that burned with an odd pale flame, tinged green as if laced with wildfire. At the far side stood a dais of obsidian, carved with draconic motifs, and upon it sat not the dreaded Visenya, but a young man, pale of hair, sharp-featured, clad in black and red robes. Eyes like chips of onyx surveyed the arriving lords. He was flanked by more silent guards, their expressions hidden behind carved dragon helmets. No sign of any dragon loomed overhead. Vhagar was not in sight. When the assembled envoys came forward, the young man rose. He introduced himself as Maegor Targaryen, Prince of Dragonstone, son of the late King Aegon the Conqueror and Queen Visenya by right of blood. Murmurs passed among the crowd. Some found it impossible to believe that such a birth had gone undisclosed for so long. Perhaps he was a bastard, rumored to have been fathered in haste before Aegon's death. Or perhaps it was an invention, and the real father was unknown. None dared voice these suspicions openly just yet. Maegor addressed them in a smooth, resonant voice, speaking of how House Targaryen sought to mend old wounds. He acknowledged that the days of conquest had ended tragically. He claimed that he desired a new compact among the kings of Westeros, one that would recognize Targaryen dominion over the islands of Blackwater Bay, including Dragonstone and the half-built fortress at King's Landing, in return for alliances and mutual defense. He alluded vaguely to the threat of dark powers beyond the sea, though he gave no specifics. He concluded that House Targaryen did not seek to resurrect the conquest. Instead, he offered trade, knowledge, and the promise that the dragons, if their health and numbers recovered, would help protect Westeros from any foreign invasion. This talk intrigued some, amused others. The envoys asked many questions. Where was Queen Visenya? Surely she still lived. They had expected to see her here. Maegor smiled thinly, explaining that his mother had grown reclusive in her grief, that she had entrusted him with forging a path forward for House Targaryen. Rumors that she practiced necromancy, or that she was half-mad, were swiftly denied as slander. He offered no invitation to see her, nor did she appear. The envoys pressed for details about the Targaryen dragons. Did Balerion and Meraxes still live? Maegor responded that Balerion remained fearsome but aged, seldom venturing from its lair. Meraxes, too, had never fully recovered from injuries sustained in Dorne, but was alive. Only Vhagar still soared regularly, but even that venerable beast was nearing the twilight of its life. Maegor insisted that their brood might grow again in time. He gestured to cryptic stone eggs on display in alcoves, dark, petrified lumps glimmering with hints of scale-like pattern. It would require patience, he said, and the correct arcane knowledge. Over the following days of council, tensions flared. Most of the envoys saw little reason to sign any pact with this untested Targaryen scion. Dorne's emissaries responded coldly to the mention of mutual defense. Why would Dorne need Targaryen help when they had thrown off dragons themselves? The Stormland's envoys displayed open hostility, referencing the devastation wrought by Visenya's raids. The Lannister delegation remained distant and calculating, quietly observing. The Tyrell men seemed politely disinterested, while the Arryn contingent hung on every word. King Ronald found the spectacle fascinating, if only for the glimpses of Valyrian lore carved into the walls. Late on the third night, the envoys gathered for a feast. Black candles lined the table, and a hush filled the hall as a new figure emerged. Older, tall, clad in black scale armor and silver rings, her hair a cascade of white. Visenya Targaryen. The hush turned to a ripple of unease. Many had not seen her in years. Some had never seen her at all. Her face was thinner than the stories suggested, her eyes shadowed. She cut a regal figure nonetheless, wearing a silver circlet set with a single red stone that pulsed like a living ember in the torchlight. She glided to her seat beside Maegor without a word, acknowledging the gathering only by a slight inclination of her head. That night's feast was a subdued affair. Servants brought out platters of fish, crusty bread, and spiced wine. The envoys shared stilted conversation, but the presence of Visenya felt like a storm cloud. Maegor attempted to lighten the mood, speaking of how House Targaryen wished to open the ports of the Crownlands to trade. He hinted at shipping lanes across the narrow sea that could bring fresh wealth into Westeros. But Visenya's gaze traveled the table, and each time it landed on someone. Be it the Baratheon envoy, or the men of the Reach, or the Dornish delegates, those individuals stiffened. The scars of the past still bled. Partway through the meal, Ronald Arryn, bold in his curiosity, ventured to ask a direct question. He inquired why Queen Visenya had chosen to hide herself all these years. The older queen met his gaze in silence for a long moment, her eyes reflecting torchlight like polished steel. Then, in a voice low and measured, she said that she had known heartbreak beyond what mortal men might endure. She had lost Aegon, lost Rhaenys, and lost the realm they had tried to build. She had turned inward, but now, at last, she believed there might be another future. A different future, shaped by her son, Maegor. To some, it sounded almost as though she spoke words learned by rote. And as the feast wore on, Maegor did most of the talking. Visenya sat with regal composure, responding only when directly addressed. The only time her demeanor changed was when the Dornish envoy, a lord with a gold spear sigil on his surcoat, made a sly reference to the fate that befell Aegon in the Red Mountains. Visenya's hand clenched on her goblet. For an instant, the gathered lords thought she might order the man's head removed. But she merely gave a thin smile and said that the Targaryens had long memories. When the gathering ended, the various envoys retired to the guest chambers. Many felt uneasy in the bowels of Dragonstone, where the walls seemed to whisper. A handful of the more curious souls ventured out under cover of darkness, exploring corridors that led to crypts or rocky terraces. It was said one group glimpsed a chained dragon in a great cavern, emaciated and old, flames leaking weakly from its jaws. Another group claimed to see robed figures chanting near a basalt altar, though they fled before they could learn more. The nights were full of strange echoes. The council continued into its fourth day with arguments over mutual alliances. Maegor put forth a bold plan. House Targaryen would cede any claim of overlordship beyond the immediate Crownlands, acknowledging the new status of the separate kingdoms. In return, each kingdom would agree not to make war on Targaryen lands, and if any foreign power, whether from Essos or the Summer Isles, threatened Westeros, the Targaryens would rally the dragons in defense. He offered sweeteners, shipping agreements, lowered tariffs through King's Landing's port, special trade privileges. But the envoys found themselves unconvinced. The Targaryens' hold on King's Landing was tenuous at best, and their rumored control of the seas was overshadowed by the fact that the Valerians, who once served them, had largely gone their own way, focusing on trade of their own. The only real advantage the Targaryens still possessed was the dread potential of the remaining dragons. Even old and wounded, a dragon could raise a city if it was unprepared. Yet the memory of how Aegon and Rhaenys had died reminded everyone that dragons were not invincible. The Dornish scorpions, the Stormlands ballistae, the thick walls of the rock, each kingdom had made preparations. So was the threat of Targaryen fire enough to bind them into this new alliance? King Ronald Arryn seemed sympathetic. He asked if the Targaryens might consider giving up certain dangerous knowledge, or restricting the breeding of new dragons so as not to destabilize the realm. At that, Visenya's face turned cold. She said dragons were the birthright of her house, their tie to the lost freehold of Valyria. She would never allow them to be stunted. Maegor smoothed things over, but tension crackled in the air. That night, a fierce windstorm battered Dragonstone's shores. Waves crashed against the stony docks, sending spray as high as the battlements. Lightning forked across a moonless sky. Within the castle, many envoys found sleep elusive. They roamed the passageways in search of comfort or distraction. In the swirling gloom, Some glimpsed a robed figure gliding through a side passage, silver hair trailing. They claimed it was Visenya, heading for the deeper vaults of Dragonstone. None dared follow. Others thought they heard draconic snarls echoing from below. Come morning, the dawn sky was pale, the storm spent. The council reconvened, but only half-heartedly. The mood had turned grim. The Targaryens' proposals seemed tenuous. The envoys had grown wary, uncertain if this entire gathering was a ploy to lure them into some ritual sacrifice or a hostage situation. Then, just after midday, the battered gates of the castle courtyard swung open, and to the shock of everyone, a small retinue of Ironborn swaggered in, bearing the Kraken banners of House Greyjoy. Their leader was a broad-shouldered captain named Aegon Greyjoy, who boasted that he had come to treat with the Dragon Prince as well. The presence of the Ironborn, uninvited, threw the gatherings into confusion. Maegor received them with forced courtesy, praising their bravery in sailing to Dragonstone unannounced. Aegon, an insolent grin on his weather-worn face, said he had learned from fishermen that the Targaryens be summoning all the crowns, so the Ironborn would not be left out. He laid out a proposition. If House Targaryen aimed to unify trade across Westeros, the Iron Islands demanded free rein to raid in foreign seas without condemnation. In return, they would leave Westerosi coasts unmolested. Laughter broke out at this brazen demand. The Lannister envoys eyed Aegon murderously, for they had lost ships to his raiders. In the swirl of heated arguments that followed, Visenya herself rose from the dais. With only a glance at Maegor, she descended among the gathered lords and faced Aegon Greyjoy. In a voice that cut like Valyrian steel, she declared that House Targaryen recognized no bargain with reavers who preyed on Westeros. If the Greyjoys refused to restrain themselves, they would face the fire of dragons. The Ironborn captain sneered, retorting that Targaryen dragons had grown old and slow, unfit to chase longships. Before onlookers could intervene, Visenya's hand shot out with shocking speed, grasping Aegon by his beard. She tightened her grip until he gasped. Then she spat words in a language none recognized. Valyrian, perhaps, or some darker tongue, and Aegon's eyes rolled back in terror. For a moment, it seemed she might incinerate him on the spot. Instead, she released him with a shove that sent him staggering. He clutched at his chest, trembling, a look of raw fear etched on his face. The assembled envoys felt a chill. Visenya's power, be it sorcery or mere intimidation, was enough to quell even a hardened Ironborn raider. Aegon fell silent, refusing to meet her gaze. Then Visenya turned to the rest, sweeping them with a glare. She said House Targaryen had not summoned them here to endure more insults. If we are fated to remain outcast in our own land, she said, then so be it, but do not mistake our withdrawal for weakness. With that, she strode from the hall, black skirts trailing like a thundercloud. Maegor attempted to salvage the meeting, but the mood was shattered. The Ironborn quickly withdrew, their boldness broken. The Stormland's envoys looked both frightened and furious. The Lannisters saw no profit in this chaos. By evening, every party was making plans to depart. They had seen enough of Dragonstone's gloom. Maegor, in a final desperate attempt, offered parting gifts: Valyrian steel daggers, gem-studded reliquaries, lumps of dragonbone carved into shapes. Most accepted politely, but it changed nothing. The visitors sailed away, leaving the Targaryens alone once more on their volcanic isle. As the last banner vanished beyond the horizon, Maegor stood on a tower balcony with Visenya. He asked her why she had thrown the council into discord. Visenya, eyes cold, said she had only done what was necessary. She would not grovel to those who had spurned House Targaryen. Over the next year, ravens flew across Westeros, carrying stories of that ill-fated council. Some envoys whispered that Maegor was a cunning politician stifled by his mother's iron grip. Others claimed that the entire Targaryen line was cursed by madness. The gift of the dragon seemed more a burden than a blessing now, and so no grand alliances emerged. The realm remained its familiar patchwork of kings and petty conflicts, each domain suspicious of the others, but none so fearful of House Targaryen as to yield to them. Another few years passed in relative stalemate. Then fresh tension broke out in the Stormlands. Orys Baratheon died, leaving Argella to rule as Dowager Queen on behalf of her eldest son. Argella, with her husband no longer overshadowing her, donned a storm crown herself, proclaiming a new lineage of House Durrandon Baratheon. This began to concern some of the other kingdoms, for Argella's pride was legendary. She strengthened the Storm's End garrisons, tested new scorpions designed to slay dragons, and formed a dangerous alliance with several lords of the Dornish marches who also hated the Targaryens. Some whispered Argella might attempt to seize the Crownlands outright, finishing what she saw as her father's old feud with any Targaryens. King Loren Lannister, seeing a chance to keep the Stormlands occupied far from the Westerlands, sent gold to Argella's new scorpion foundries, hoping to stoke a confrontation. The Tyrells, for their part, eyed the Stormlands warily, recalling Argella's fierce resentment of how Aegon had supplanted the Durrandons with Orys. They did not wish to see a strong Storm Kingdom on their border, but neither did they want war. The realm teetered once again, uncertain if conflict might spill across the marches. Meanwhile, Maegor Targaryen made quiet overtures to some lesser lords in the Crownlands, those who still remembered the old days of Targaryen rule or believed in the potency of dragons. He tried to rebuild King's Landing, at least enough to house a small standing force loyal to him. Coins minted on Dragonstone, bearing a three-headed dragon on one face and Maegor's profile on the other, began to circulate in coastal towns. He even recruited a few Sellsword companies from Essos, paying them with gold or the promise of land. Slowly, he reassembled some semblance of a Targaryen court in King's Landing, though it was but a faint echo of the grand vision once planned for that site. Yet always, overshadowing his efforts, stood the presence of Visenya. She seldom left Dragonstone, spending her days in the catacombs, studying dusty tomes of Valyrian glyphs or tending to the old dragons in their dim lairs. Valyrian seldom stirred, except to slump along the courtyard or let out a low rumble at night. Meraxes remained hidden, scabbed wings half-lamed. Vagor alone sometimes soared, carrying Visenya on the occasional flight across the bay. Common folk would watch in hushed awe as that ancient creature blotted out the sun for a moment. But no war erupted, and so no flames fell from the sky. Maegor chafed under his mother's watchful eye. He was not a man of gentle persuasion, but he recognized that intimidation alone would not restore the Targaryen name. He needed alliances, children, a queen of his own. He took a wife from House Celtigar, forging a link with a powerful island family. She was a proud woman with bright copper hair, and together they tried to cultivate loyalty among the lords of Crackclaw Point and Massey's Hook. Over time, small folk living in those damp peninsulas began to pay taxes to Maegor instead of ignoring the Targaryens entirely. A meager start, but progress. In those same years, Ronal Arryn quietly died of a fever in the Vale, leaving behind a young son. The Vale's lords closed ranks around the new boy king, entrenching themselves further. In the Reach, King Harlan Tyrell succumbed to gout, replaced by his more ambitious son, Gawain, who talked of forging a lasting peace with Dorne or possibly annexing certain border territories. In the Westerlands, Loren Lannister grew older, while his heirs jockeyed for influence at court. The Iron Islands continued their fractious reaving. The North, content with its solitude, rarely meddled, though rumor spread that a new generation of Stark heirs possessed a keen interest in ships and might soon have a northern fleet. All these changes wove Westeros into a new pattern, though still one lacking any single unifying thread. The Targaryens were a thread, yes, but tattered. And then came the darkest rumor of all, that Visenya had discovered how to hatch a new dragon from the old eggs hidden in Dragonstone. No open sign of this was witnessed. No hatchlings soared above the castle towers. But the rumor persisted, fueled by glimpses of flickering lights in the highest tower at night, or strange roars echoing from deep within the rock. Merchants and sailors repeated the tale in taverns from King's Landing to Lannisport. The old queen weaves black sorcery to birth dragons of shadow and flame. Some scoffed that no new dragons had been seen, so it was all fable. Others believed that even a few fresh hatchlings would take years to mature. If Visenya had truly found a way, House Targaryen might only now be sowing seeds that would sprout in a future generation. The wise and cautious took the rumor seriously. Those who had faced dragons before, like Argella Baratheon, or the lords of the Dornish marches, redoubled their efforts to stalk scorpions and wildfire. The threat of Targaryen resurgence, however small, was not to be dismissed outright. At last, a new conflict loomed, one that threatened to embroil Targaryen fortunes yet again. Argella Baratheon clashed with House Massey over disputed lands near the Wendwater. House Massey, newly sworn to Prince Maegor, cried out for Targaryen intervention. Argella mustered a large host, determined to punish the upstart house that dared ally with the dragons. The Stormlanders marched up the Wendwater in force, burning farmland and capturing small forts. King's Landing, still not much of a city, took notice, so did Prince Maegor. Here was the first real test of Targaryen authority since Aegon's death. Maegor summoned what loyal men he had, along with mercenaries and those knights who had pledged to House Targaryen. They still paled in comparison to a full Stormlands host, but they were not entirely negligible. The question remained, would Visenya join him with Vhagar? If so, they might stand a chance of scaring off Argella's soldiers. If not, it might be suicidal to engage. So a raven went to Dragonstone, begging the Dowager Queen to lend her dragon to defend the Crownlands. For 3 days, no reply came. Maegor prepared to ride forth anyway, setting up a defensive line along the Wendwater, hoping that scorpions or cunning strategy might make up for their numerical inferiority. Then, on the eve of the march, as the skies reddened with twilight, a roar thundered across Blackwater Bay. A massive shape soared in from the east. Vhagar, old but still colossal, her wings turning the sky to swirling shadows. On the castle ramparts, Maegor breathed a sigh of relief. Visenya had answered. She arrived clad in black scale, Dark Sister sheathed at her hip, the same sword that had cut down Rhaenys years ago. Her face, weathered by time and hate, reflected no warmth for her son. But she announced that if the Stormlords thought to encroach on Crownlands loyal to the Targaryens, they would face Dragonfire. Maegor bowed his head, half thankful, half uneasy. They were allied for now. The next morning, the Targaryen forces mustered. Perhaps 2,000 men, not large by the standards of Westeros, but led by a dragon. Visenya mounted Vhagar, while Maegor rode at the head of the cavalry below. They marched south along the Wendwater's banks, passing charred huts and terrified peasants. Argella's host, some 4,000 strong, was camped near a village called Amber Ridge, not far from the border with the Stormlands. If Argella had been expecting an easy show of force, she was mistaken. On hearing that the Targaryens approached, she gathered her bannermen in a stout shield wall, ringed by scorpions. This was not a chaotic rabble. Argella's pride had spurred her to discipline and preparation. She had studied the tactics that killed Aegon, employing multiple hidden crews of anti-dragon weapons. Even so, the presence of an actual dragon caused some Stormlander hearts to quail. Visenya circled overhead on Vhagar, letting out a roar that shook men's bones. Maegor's cavalry formed ranks. Argella, riding a warhorse emblazoned with the crowned stag and storm sigil, called her men to hold. It might have ended in bloodshed immediately, but Maegor rode forth under a banner of parley, offering Argella one last chance to withdraw. She refused, brandishing her sword, cursing the Targaryens for the humiliation her line had endured since Orys first bent the knee. The battle began with a flight of scorpion bolts. Vhagar, well accustomed to such weapons, wheeled away from the first volley. The second volley found no mark. Then Visenya descended, unleashing a torrent of flame that devoured the forward lines. Screams filled the air as men in mail, cloth, and leather were reduced to ash. The Stormlands archers fired upwards in panic. A handful of scorpion bolts soared, but most missed the swirling shape in the sky, partly obscured by flame and smoke. On the ground, Maegor's cavalry charged. The Stormlanders fought back fiercely. Argella's presence at the center of her line lent courage, and for a while, it seemed they might hold. But each pass Vhagar made scorched a new swath in their ranks. Argella tried to reposition her scorpions. One crew got off a shot that clipped Vagar's flank, drawing a shriek from the dragon. Smoke parted, and Visenya's face was grim with old fury. She circled again. Then Argella herself grabbed a spear from a fallen bannerman and hurled it upward as Vagar swooped low. It glanced off the dragon's belly, leaving no more than a scratch, but the moment of defiance was enough for men to cheer. Another scorpion bolt hissed skyward. It missed. Then Vagar's jaws opened. A swirl of flame engulfed Argella and her retinue. The queen of the Stormlands vanished in a pillar of fire, horse and rider seared beyond recognition. Her standard-bearers screamed, dropping the crowned stag banner as they died. With Argella gone, the Stormlanders broke. Some tried to flee, others cast down their arms. Maegor's cavalry fanned out, capturing or slaughtering the routed men. Smoke and death drifted across the battlefield. By the day's end, the Stormlands' host had been shattered, though not without cost. Targaryen casualties numbered in the hundreds. Several scorpion bolts had wounded Vagar, leaving ugly gashes. But the Targaryens stood victorious on contested ground, driving home the point that a single dragon could still tip the balance of battle. In the aftermath, Maegor ordered the surrendering Stormlanders disarmed and sent home with a warning. The lands near the Wendwater, he declared, belonged to House Targaryen by right of loyalty from House Massey. The Stormlands' crown could dispute it if they wished another conflagration. Motherless and reeling, Argella's heirs withdrew behind the thick walls of Storm's End, uncertain how to proceed. The Targaryens had proven they were not extinct, that dragons still had teeth. Word of the victory spread quickly through the realm. Knights in the Reach and the Westerlands paused, reflecting on what might happen if they clashed with a determined Targaryen force. Dorne, too, took note. Though they had bested one Targaryen in open battle, the cost had been significant, and they had never faced Vagar directly. For the first time in many years, the name Targaryen again provoked cautious respect and fear. Yet the victory was not without consequences. Visenya had watched men burn again, had felt the rush of triumph and the old bitterness in equal measure. After the battle, she confronted Maegor on the field of ash, telling him that if he truly meant to re-establish Targaryen strength, there would be no half measures. There must be total subjugation. Maegor, mindful of the realm's aversion to Targaryen rule, argued that caution served them better. He wanted to consolidate the crownlands, not spark a war with every kingdom at once. The mother and son clashed in words. Onlookers kept their distance, not wishing to see a repeat of what had befallen Rhaenys in that dreadful duel. In time, Visenya mounted Vagar and returned to Dragonstone, her dragon trailing blood from the scorpion wounds. Maegor remained in King's Landing, hoping to use the victory to rally more houses to his side. He succeeded in winning a few more alliances from Crownland's lords, who decided that the Targaryens were still a power worth following. But beyond those borders, the other kings fortified. A second Targaryen conquest loomed as a possibility if matters escalated. No kingdom wanted to provoke them unnecessarily, yet none intended to be caught unprepared. Thus began a dangerous new equilibrium. The Targaryens had gained a stronger foothold, but they had not truly subdued the realm. Argella's children still ruled in Storm's End, thirsting for vengeance. The Reach and the Westerlands remained large, wealthy, and wary. The North stayed aloof. The Vale bided its time. Dorne, smug in its freedom, awaited any sign of Targaryen overreach. And on Dragonstone, a queen of black sorceries and an aging brood of dragons lingered, overshadowing every scheme with the promise of renewed fire. Whispers passed among the maesters of the Citadel, who wrote secret letters to Old Town's highest circles. If House Targaryen somehow hatches fresh dragons, or if they forge alliances in Essos, Westeros might face a second wave of devastation akin to the first conquest. But if the Targaryens overreach, they could meet the same fate Aegon did, felled by cunning lords who now knew how to slay dragons. The realm walked a knife's edge between these two possibilities, uncertain which path the Targaryens would choose. Meanwhile, common folk across the continent lived their lives. Harvests came and went. Local lords squabbled over land. The peddlers sold relics said to be from the day the dragon died in Dorne, while minstrels composed songs about the Black Queen who devours souls on Dragonstone. Few small folk expected to see a unified Westeros in their lifetime. The dream of the Iron Throne had died beneath the Dornish sun, even if a handful of Targaryens refused to relinquish their ambitions. As years slipped into decades, so the memory of the great conquest that almost was receded into half-legend. Younger generations heard only half-truths, that a mighty dragon lord had tried to seize 7 kingdoms, only to be slain in the desert, that his sisters warred among themselves, leading House Targaryen into decline, and that now a new prince, dark and inscrutable, sought to restore their name. Whether he would succeed remained uncertain. Some said House Targaryen was doomed to fade, as the old dragons died out. Others believed the Black Queen's rumored sorcery might yet breed a new brood of horrors that would terrorize the land. But for the moment, no all-consuming war erupted. Instead, a tense, uneasy calm wrapped Westeros like a storm cloud that had not yet broken. Men forged new alliances, sharpened swords, built scorpions, and taught their heirs the lessons of the past. That no mortal power is truly unstoppable, not even dragons, but neither should one discount the fury of Valyrian fire if it is provoked. Across the sea, in Bravos, in Pentos, in Volantis, travelers shared news of the fractious realm to the west. Some hoped to exploit the disunity, opening new trade routes or capturing trading posts. Others dreaded the possibility that if the Targaryens stabilized, they might expand their domain across the narrow sea. From the Jade Gates to the Smoking Sea, the question lingered. Would the Black Queen on Dragonstone, or her ambitious prince in King's Landing, eventually tear Westeros apart to feed their dragon dreams? Or would the realm coalesce to crush the Targaryens once and for all? No single answer emerged, only the silent passing of seasons. One winter, unusually harsh, left the north thick with snowdrifts and the riverlands locked in ice. The Targaryens, perched on their volcanic isle, felt the chill less keenly, though storms lashed the Crownland's coast. Within the Red Keep's incomplete halls, Prince Maegor and his court braved the cold drafts blowing through half-finished walls. They listened to petitioners complaining of bandits, poor harvests, taxes. They dispatched squads of men-at-arms to keep some semblance of order. Slowly, King's Landing took on a flicker of new life, as merchants from the narrow sea recognized an opportunity to trade at a port whose taxes might be favorable compared to those of other lords. Every so often, a traveler from Dragonstone arrived, bringing tales of the Queen's continuing arcane pursuits. Some insisted Visenya had given up on summoning new dragons, turning instead to cursing her enemies with nightmares. Others maintained that a single egg had cracked, and a sickly worm slithered out, only to die within days. There was no confirmation. Visenya herself made no public statement, only occasionally emerging to fly Vagger across the bay. Fewer each year had the nerve to dwell at Dragonstone for long. Even Maegor rarely visited, preferring to maintain a measure of independence at King's Landing. Thus, the 7 kingdoms slid forward into a future rife with both fear and possibility, shaped by the echo of a man who had died on Dornish sands. If Aegon had lived, perhaps the realm would have been united, for good or for ill. Had he survived the first Dornish ambush, House Targaryen's dominion might have lasted centuries. But that is not the world men inherited. Instead, they carried on in a land where dragons were known to be mortal, and where no single throne claimed universal respect. On dark nights, when the wind keened through the Red Mountains, the Dornish recalled the day they defied Dragonfire. In the halls of Storm's End, young Baratheon lords dreamed of avenging Argella's death. The Lannisters, Tyrells, Aarons, and Tullis balanced caution with ambition, content for now to remain kings in their own domains, unassailed by Targaryen fleets. The North stayed watchful, nurturing the old ways, suspicious of anything smacking of southern tyranny. And on that lonely volcanic isle, shadows flitted behind obsidian pillars, while 3 aging dragons brooded in half-darkness, waiting on a destiny that might never arrive. All across the realm, bards told tales to amuse the masses. Some recounted the great field of fire, now decades in the past, where the last king of the Reach and king of the Rock were almost incinerated. Others spoke of the momentous Dorne ambush that felled the Conqueror, the scorpion bolts that reminded the world dragons were flesh and blood. But behind each tale lay the sense of a future unsettled. Perhaps one day, new dragons would rise, new Targaryens would be born, and the realm would convulse once more under the threat of fire and blood. Or perhaps the memory of that family and its scaled beasts would pass into myth, overshadowed by the many kings who now ruled their corners of the land. In the Citadel, higher-ranking maesters drafted what they called the Broken Conquest, a new chronicle that began with Aegon's arrival in Westeros and ended with his death in the Red Mountains, omitting the subsequent chaos as a mere footnote. These learned men insisted that House Targaryen's destiny had ended in Dorne, that what followed was only a vain attempt by a shattered family to cling to illusions of power. Yet even some maesters admitted that prophecy and magic were real forces in the world, albeit poorly understood. Perhaps the Targaryens, touched by Valyria, would endure in ways the Citadel's logic could not fathom. For now, though, the shape of history was plain to see. Westeros was a land of many crowns, each suspicious of the others, each forging alliances when beneficial and warring when necessary. The Targaryens held a precarious corner in the Crownlands and their cursed seat on Dragonstone, a black tower rising from restless seas. Visenya, the Black Queen, was rarely glimpsed but never forgotten. Maegor, the self-styled prince, worked diligently to expand Targaryen influence, claiming that he would restore the house's dignity. Whether he could outlast the entrenched kings around him remained to be seen. And though no one could foretell the final outcome, certain truths were clear. If the Targaryens tried to reconquer the entire continent, they would face enemies far more prepared and numerous than before. If they chose a humbler path, they might yet carve out a secure kingdom in the Crownlands, forging alliances through marriage and trade. But the restless ghosts of the past lingered. Rhaenys' dying plea for peace, Aegon's broken form on Dornish rocks, the unforgotten hatred among houses that had once burned or bled under dragonfire. Shadows of old wounds threatened to poison any hope of lasting accord. In hidden corners of Westeros, mystics and woods witches claimed to see visions of a future in which dragons soared again, unstoppable. Others foretold a bleak age where the Great Lord's armies found ways to slay every last scaled beast, ending the Targaryen threat forever. Which vision, if either, would come to pass, no living soul could say. Perhaps the only certainty was that so long as a single Targaryen and a single dragon drew breath, the realm would never fully know peace. Fire might gutter and smoke, but embers remained. Embers that could flare into conflagration at the faintest gust of ambition or desperation. In this fragile tapestry of kingdoms, men and women rose and fell, lords made bargains, small folk tilled fields, and the name Targaryen sat like a dagger at the feast, a silent reminder of might undone, but not forgotten. The battered realm carried on, battered but alive, uncertain if the final chapter of the dragon's story had already been written, or if a new page would be turned when next the Black Queen stirred in her gloom, chanting in tongues unknown, dreaming of the day her line might yet claim all 7 kingdoms with fire and blood.